You know, sometimes you buy a house on a lake, thinking about peaceful mornings and quiet sunsets, not about waging war with the neighborhood committee over your own dock. But that's exactly where I found myself when our homeowners association, spearheaded by the relentlessly entitled Brenda, decided my brand new, privately owned floating dock was the perfect spot for their annual summer bash, without asking, of course. So, while they partied on my property, claiming dominion over the water, I simply helped my dock embrace its destiny, becoming a very exclusive, very mobile party barge, drifting serenely towards the middle of the lake. If you think that's where the story ends, buckle up, because Mother Nature decided to RSVP with a vengeance, and the resulting legal storm was almost as fierce as the meteorological one. It all started this summer after I bought my little piece of lakeside paradise. It wasn't a huge place, but it was mine, and the key feature, the thing that sold me, was the waterfront access and the potential for a really great dock. The existing structure was old and rickety, barely usable. So, my first major project, even before tackling the dated kitchen, was installing a beautiful, state-of-the-art floating dock system. We're talking high-density polyethylene floats, sturdy aluminum framing, composite decking that wouldn't splinter, the works. It cost a small fortune, easily tens of thousands of dollars, and required permits, surveys, and dealing with the county, all meticulously documented. Naturally, it was attached to my land via a hinged ramp and anchored securely, or so I thought, using a system of heavy concrete anchors and chains designed for variable water levels. Crucially, the surveys confirmed unequivocally the shoreline it launched from and the water access rights were exclusively part of my deeded property, explicitly carved out and noted as not communal HOA land when the development was originally plotted decades ago. I even had the original surveyor's markers located and flagged again just to be sure. This dock was my sanctuary, the place I planned to read, fish, launch my kayak, and host my own small gatherings, like my upcoming birthday barbecue which I'd been planning for weeks. The HOA had its own small, somewhat dilapidated community beach and picnic area on the other side of the cove, perfectly adequate for their needs, but apparently not prestigious enough for Brenda, our newly elected HOA president, with an ego the size of the lake itself. Brenda lived several streets away from the water, a fact I suspected fueled her bizarre sense of entitlement regarding the lakefront properties. My initial interactions with her had been minimal, but always tinged with a weird sense of ownership on her part, commenting on my lawn care, the color I painted my trim, the placement of my garbage cans on trash day. Typical HOA busybody stuff, which I mostly ignored, being careful to stay within the actual written bylaws. The first inkling of trouble came about 2 weeks before my birthday, which coincided with the HOA's planned Summer Fun Day. I received a generic email newsletter outlining the event: barbecue, games, music, the usual. It mentioned vaguely activities by the lake. Given the community beach area, I didn't think much of it. Then, a week later, I was sitting on my porch swing enjoying the late afternoon sun, when Brenda and 2 other board members strolled down my driveway like they owned the place. Brenda, a woman whose floral print muumuu seemed to barely contain her indignation at the world, gestured grandly towards my dock. "This will be perfect," she announced, not to me specifically, but more to her companions and the universe at large. "Plenty of room for the catering setup, and the view is much better here than at the community point." I stood up, bewildered. "Excuse me, Brenda, what are you talking about?" "This is my private dock." She finally turned her attention to me, offering a condescending smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, hello, dear," she said, as if noticing me for the first time. "We're just planning the Summer Fun Day. And this lovely dock," she patted the railing, "will be the centerpiece. So much nicer than that grubby little beach, don't you think?" I felt a prickle of anger. "Brenda, this dock isn't HOA property. It's mine. I paid for it. It's attached to my land, and it's listed on my deed. You can't use it for your event." She waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. All lake access benefits the community. It's practically community property. Think of it as lake frontage beautification contribution. Besides, where else would we do the fancy catered portion? The community area is just for the hot dogs and kids' games. This, she gestured again, is for the adults, the ambiance. The two board members behind her nodded sycophantically. One of them, Mark, a retired accountant who seemed terrified of Brenda, mumbled something about shared lake resources. The other, Carol, just beamed, clearly thrilled at the prospect of a party upgrade. I stood my ground. No, Brenda, it's not happening. You have the community area designated for these things. My dock is off limits. That's final. I pointed towards the road. Now, if you don't mind, you're trespassing. Brenda's smile vanished, replaced by a glare. We'll see about that, she sniffed. Some people just don't understand the concept of community spirit. They turned and walked back up the driveway, leaving me fuming. I immediately sent a formal email to the entire HOA board, CCing their generic admin address, stating clearly that my property, including the dock, was not available for the Summer Fun Day event, citing the property lines and deed information, and explicitly forbidding them access. I received no reply. The sheer audacity was astounding. She wasn't just mistaken, she was deliberately ignoring clearly defined property rights for her convenience and social climbing. The battle lines, it seemed, had been drawn right at the edge of my beautiful, expensive, and very private dock. My planned quiet birthday weekend was suddenly looking a lot more complicated, and the seeds of a counterplan began to sprout in my increasingly indignant mind. I started researching floating dock anchor systems online, specifically the quick-release mechanisms used for seasonal removal or storm preparation. My dock had a robust anchoring system, but I realized the main shore connection point and the anchor chains might have points that could, theoretically, be disengaged with the right tools and knowledge. It was just a thought, a kernel of defiance, but it was growing. The following week was a tense standoff, conducted mostly through stony silence. I saw Brenda driving slowly past my house a couple of times, peering towards the dock with a calculating look. I made sure my no trespassing signs, newly purchased and strategically placed, were clearly visible near the driveway entrance and at the path leading to the dock. I also installed a couple of extra security cameras, focusing one directly on the dock and its access point. My email remained unanswered, but I saw flyers posted around the neighborhood boldly proclaiming the Adult Lakeside Lounge portion of the Summer Fun Day event would be held at the Scenic Dock at 12 Lakeview Drive, my address. Unbelievable. They weren't just planning on trespassing, they were advertising it. My blood pressure spiked. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a deliberate provocation. My quiet lakeside retreat was turning into a battleground. My birthday was just 2 days away, falling on the Saturday of the HOA event. My plans for a relaxed barbecue with a few close friends felt increasingly fragile. Could I really enjoy myself with Brenda and her cronies potentially setting up shop 20 feet away? I redoubled my efforts, sending another, more forceful email, this time citing specific state trespassing laws and referencing my previous unanswered communication. I attached copies of the relevant sections of my property deed and the survey map. Still, silence. It was like dealing with a brick wall, a very smug, floral print brick wall. Friday afternoon, the day before the event and my birthday, confirmed my worst fears. While I was out picking up supplies for my own intended party, I returned to find clear evidence of their intentions. A large rented generator was sitting near my side yard, just off the path to the dock. Several folding tables and stacks of chairs were piled neatly beside it, and on the dock itself, strings of patio lights were already being attached to the railings I'd so carefully selected. They hadn't just ignored me, they had actively invaded my property in my absence to begin their setup. Fury, cold and sharp, coursed through me. This was beyond negligence or misunderstanding. This was willful, deliberate trespass and appropriation of my private property. I documented everything with my phone camera, the generator, the tables, the chairs, the lights, their positioning clearly on my side of the property markers. I tried calling Brenda's number, which I had from the HOA directory. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice tight with anger, demanding they remove their equipment immediately and stating I would consider it abandoned property if it wasn't gone within the hour. I called the generic HOA number, voicemail again. It was clear they were actively avoiding me, planning to railroad me through sheer force of will and presumptuousness. Okay, I thought. If they want to treat my dock like a public party boat, maybe I can help it lean into that role. My earlier research into the dock's anchoring system suddenly felt less theoretical and more like a viable, necessary response. It was a high-quality floating dock, designed to handle waves and changing water levels. Its connection to the shore ramp was robust but hinged, and the primary anchors keeping it positioned were heavy concrete blocks connected by chains to attachment points on the dock's underside frame. Accessing those connection points wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible, especially for someone who had paid close attention during the installation and asked the crew detailed questions. I remembered the installers mentioning quick-release shackles designed for winter storage removal in colder climates. Even though mine were standard bolts, the principle of detachment was there. I had the tools. I had the knowledge. And now, I had the motivation. My birthday barbecue plans were officially canceled in my mind, replaced by a much more fluid situation. The forecast for Saturday afternoon, I recalled grimly, mentioned a chance of thunderstorms. Perfect. That Friday night was spent less in birthday eve anticipation and more in meticulous, albeit slightly nerve-wracked preparation. Sleep was fitful. My mind raced with checklists and potential consequences, but overriding the anxiety was a steely resolve. They had crossed a line, multiple lines in fact, trespassing, ignoring legal warnings, arrogantly assuming access to expensive private property. My response felt proportional, almost necessary. It wasn't just about the dock anymore. It was about standing up to the bullying entitlement that Brenda and her faction represented. First light on Saturday, my birthday, I was up. The air was already thick and humid, hinting at the stormy weather predicted for later. The HOA's party supplies were still brazenly deposited on my property, mocking my ignored demands. Perfect. I dressed in old clothes and gathered my tools. A heavy-duty wrench set, a pry bar, bolt cutters capable of handling thick chain if needed, though I hoped to simply unbolt the shackles, waterproof grease, and strong waterproof tape. I also brought my phone, set to record video discreetly from my pocket. Down at the dock, the water lapped gently. The strings of party lights they'd half installed looked ridiculous in the dawnlight. I worked quickly and quietly. The connection to the shore ramp was the first priority. It was a heavy steel hinge pin system. After applying some grease and leveraging the pry bar carefully, I managed to work the main pins loose enough that they could be fully withdrawn later with a good tug. They were still holding, but primed for release. Next, the anchor chains. My dock had 4 main anchor points. Getting to the attachment shackles on the underside frame required leaning precariously over the edge or finding a way underneath. Luckily, the water near the shore attachment was relatively shallow, maybe 3 feet deep. I waded in. The water was cool but refreshing against the humid air. Reaching under the sturdy frame, I located the shackle bolts. They were heavy-duty stainless steel, but installed relatively recently. They hadn't seized up. With the right socket wrench and considerable effort, breaking the torque wasn't easy, but I managed to loosen the nuts on 2 of the 4 main anchor chains, the 2 closest to shore. The other 2, further out, were harder to reach and in deeper water. I decided loosening the shoreside ones would be sufficient to allow movement once the ramp was disconnected. My plan wasn't to send the dock to the other side of the lake immediately, just unmoor it. Let it become its own island, detached from my property and their assumed rights. I double-checked everything. The ramp pins were loose. 2 anchor chains were effectively neutralized at the dock connection point. The heavy concrete blocks now just dead weight on the lake bed below. The dock was still held in place by the remaining 2 anchors and the physical pressure against the shore ramp connection. It looked perfectly normal. No one observing from a distance would notice anything amiss. By 7:00 a.m., I was back inside, showered, changed, and drinking coffee, watching my security camera feed on my laptop. An hour later, the first signs of HOA activity began. A catering van arrived, parking brazenly at the bottom of my driveway. Brenda arrived shortly after, dressed in an offensively bright yellow sundress, and directing the catering staff onto my dock like a miniature Napoleon surveying her conquered territory. Tables were draped in linen, chafing dishes were set up, a portable speaker system was placed near the far edge. They strung up the rest of the party lights. It was infuriating, yet fascinating to watch their oblivious sense of ownership. The party was scheduled to start around noon. My friends, whom I texted earlier canceling our barbecue with a cryptic promise to explain later, were thankfully understanding, if confused. Around 11:30 a.m., the first guests began arriving, cocktails in hand, wandering down my path and onto the dock. Brenda greeted them effusively, pointing out the lovely facilities she had secured. My stomach churned, but my resolve hardened. Now was the time. Casually, as if just checking my lakeside garden beds, I walked down the path, staying out of direct sight of the dock, gathering but close enough to the ramp connection. The party noise, obnoxious music, loud laughter, Brenda holding court, grew louder. Waiting for a moment when the music swelled and attention seemed focused outward towards the lake, I ducked down near the ramp hinge. A quick, firm pull on the pre-loosened pins, and they slid out. Then, using the pry bar for leverage against the dock frame and the shore support, I gave a powerful shove. There was a slight groaning sound, muffled by the party noise, and then a distinct thump as the ramp connection separated completely from the dock. The dock shifted, just an inch or two at first, pulled by the slight breeze and the tension from the remaining anchor chains. No one on board seemed to notice immediately. They were too busy balancing drinks and schmoozing. I slipped away back towards my house, heart pounding, a surge of adrenaline mixed with grim satisfaction. Operation Drifting Dock Birthday Surprise was officially underway. From my porch, hidden behind a trellis thick with climbing roses, I watched. The gap between the shore ramp and the dock widened, slowly but surely. A foot, then 2 feet. Someone finally noticed. I saw a man point, confusion on his face. Then a woman gasped. The music faltered. Brenda, who had been gesturing expansively mid-anecdote, turned. Her eyes widened. Her mouth formed a perfect O of disbelief. The dock, my beautiful, expensive private dock, now carrying about 15 HOA partygoers, a full catering setup, a generator, and Brenda's ego, was gently, inexorably, drifting away from shore, becoming a tiny, self-contained island of indignation in the vastness of the lake. The initial shouts were a mixture of confusion and nervous laughter. But as the gap reached 10 feet, then 20, the mood shifted palpably towards panic. They were adrift. The scene on the drifting dock quickly transitioned from surprised confusion to low-grade chaos. Brenda, recovering her composure slightly, started issuing orders that nobody could follow. "Mark, secure it!" she yelled, pointing vaguely towards the receding shoreline. Mark, looking seasick already, just stared helplessly at the widening expanse of water. Carol was clinging to a table leg, her knuckles white. Others were peering over the edge, trying to gauge the drift speed or perhaps contemplating a swim. The generator hummed obliviously, powering the speakers that now played ironically cheerful pop music to a captive, increasingly distressed audience. The catering staff looked utterly bewildered, trapped amidst chafing dishes of rapidly cooling hors d'oeuvres. The dock wasn't moving fast, just a slow, stately glide towards the deeper center of the cove, perhaps 50 feet from shore now. It was far enough to be thoroughly inconvenient and alarming, but not immediately perilous, assuming one didn't foolishly jump into the surprisingly deep water further out. My phone, still recording from my porch vantage point, captured the widening gap and the flustered figures aboard. The 2 anchor chains I hadn't been able to fully disconnect were likely dragging their heavy concrete blocks along the silty lake bottom, slowing the drift but not stopping it entirely. It was acting more like a sea anchor than a fixed point. My feeling was less triumphant glee and more a detached sense of, well, what did you expect? They had commandeered private property, ignored warnings, and treated my space as their own playground. Now, that playground was taking them on an unscheduled tour. My intention hadn't been to put anyone in real danger, merely to strand them in their own arrogance, separate them physically from the land they had no right to occupy. But then, the sky began to darken more rapidly. The humid air grew heavy, charged with electricity. The predicted storm was rolling in earlier and faster than forecast. The wind picked up, ruffling the lake surface into choppy waves. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splatting onto the deck where I stood watching. On the drifting dock, the change was immediate and dramatic. The gentle drift turned into a more erratic bobbing and swaying as the waves grew larger. The cheerful music sputtered and died as someone frantically tried to cover the speakers. The party lights flickered precariously. People stumbled, grabbing for railings or each other. Brenda's shrieks became higher-pitched, blending genuine fear with her usual outrage. Then the rain came in earnest, a sudden torrential downpour driven by gusts of wind. Visibility dropped. The dock, caught broadside by the wind and waves, began to rock violently. I could hear faint screams over the drumming rain and rising wind. This, I admit, was more than I bargained for. Watching from my now rain-lashed porch, a knot of concern tightened in my chest. Humiliation was one thing, actual jeopardy was another. The dock was sturdy, designed for weather, but a severe thunderstorm on open water was serious. The rocking intensified. I saw through the sheeting rain a large, rented decorative inflatable flamingo, clearly part of their ambiance, cartwheel off the edge and into the churning water. Then, a stack of plastic chairs slid across the wet composite decking and followed it into the lake. A moment later, there was a louder crash and a series of splashes. It looked like one of the heavy catering tables, laden with food warmers and serving dishes, had tipped over, sending its contents sliding and possibly a person or two stumbling overboard with it. The generator sputtered, choked, and died with a pathetic cough, plunging the already gloomy scene into near silence, broken only by the storm's fury and panicked shouts. The dock looked like a scene from a disaster movie miniature set, pitching wildly, debris washing across it, figures huddled together or slipping near the edges. My carefully planned act of inconvenient repossession had been hijacked by Mother Nature, turning it into something far more frightening. Part of me felt a grim sort of satisfaction. Karma, perhaps? But another, larger part, felt responsible for putting them in the path of this amplified danger, even if I hadn't summoned the storm itself. Their terrified faces, visible in flashes, were a stark contrast to the smug entitlement they'd displayed just an hour before. The dock continued its slow, anchor-dragging drift further out, now being pushed more by the strong easterly wind than any residual momentum. Getting them back looked like it was going to be a significant and potentially dangerous undertaking. My simple act of reclaiming my space had escalated dramatically, and the consequences, I suspected, were far from over. The storm raged, trapping the HOA partygoers on their rapidly deteriorating mobile island of despair. The storm eventually blew itself out, almost as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind a bruised-looking sky, drenched landscape, and a lake surface littered with debris, mostly floral arrangements, napkins, stray plastic cups, and one very soggy inflatable flamingo bumping gently against the far shore. The dock had drifted significantly further during the squall, probably a good 200 yards out, and was now sitting relatively still in the calmer water, though listing slightly to one side. The scene aboard was one of utter disarray. People were soaked, huddled, miserable. Several chafing dishes and at least one of the heavy folding tables were clearly missing, resting on the lakebed. Remarkably, it seemed those who had tumbled into the water, reportedly 3 people, including Mark who slipped on spilled coleslaw, had managed to scramble back aboard the low-profile dock relatively quickly. wet and shocked but physically unharmed beyond a few scrapes and bruises, thanks largely to the life ring I always kept attached to the dock railing, which someone had the presence of mind to deploy. Brenda, however, looked like a drowned rat, her yellow dress plastered to her usual domineering posture replaced by shivering indignation. Someone, likely the catering staff using a cell phone protected in a plastic bag, had managed to call 911 during the worst of it. The local sheriff's department boat patrol arrived shortly after the rain stopped. Getting everyone off the dock and back to the community landing required shuttling them in small groups. It was a slow, ignominious process. They looked less like party guests and more like survivors of a shipwreck, wrapped in emergency blankets handed out by the deputies. The deputies, after ensuring everyone was safe, located me, the dock's owner, watching calmly from my porch. I explained the situation straightforwardly. The HOA had knowingly set up their party on my private property, despite explicit written warnings and trespassing notifications. I admitted to taking steps to unmoor the floating dock from my land after they occupied it, essentially evicting the trespassing structure and its occupants from my property onto the water, which seemed like a logical next step given their refusal to leave. I emphasized that the dock itself remained structurally sound, and the subsequent storm, while unfortunate, was an act of nature that significantly worsened their situation after they chose to remain on the unsecured, drifting platform. I provided copies of my emails, photos of the no trespassing signs, security footage of their unauthorized setup, and the video of the dock gently drifting away before the storm hit. The deputies listened patiently, took notes, surveyed the scene, examined the dock's disconnected ramp connection, and looked at the property line markers. One raised an eyebrow slightly when I described loosening the anchor shackles but made no comment. Their immediate concern was public safety and ensuring the dock was secured. Since it was now a potential hazard adrift, they coordinated with a local marine salvage company, contacted initially by the panicked HOA caterer, to tow the dock back toward shore, though pointedly, not back to my property. It was eventually temporarily moored at the community beach area, looking battered and listing, pending further investigation and arrangements for removal or repair assessment by the HOA, who had, after all, rented the generator and tables currently decorating the lake bottom or piled on its deck. Brenda, predictably, was spitting mad, shouting accusations of endangerment, vandalism, and demanding my immediate arrest. The deputies, however, seemed more interested in the clear evidence of trespassing presented by my documentation. They informed Brenda and the other board members present that civil remedies were likely the appropriate avenue here, and based on initial assessment, the primary offense appeared to be the HOA's unauthorized use of private property. They took statements from everyone involved, collected my evidence, and left, indicating a report would be filed. The immediate crisis was over, but the legal battle was just beginning. Within days, I received a formal demand letter from an attorney representing the HOA, full of bluster and threats. They accused me of reckless endangerment, destruction of property, their rented equipment, and the alleged damage to the dock, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and demanded exorbitant sums for damages, salvage costs, and punitive measures. They painted me as a vindictive menace who had deliberately tried to drown the pillars of their community over a simple misunderstanding about dock usage. The sheer nerve was, again, astounding. They completely omitted their own documented trespassing and refusal to vacate my property. It was a classic bully tactic: attack hard, inflate the damages, and hope the defendant folds under pressure. They underestimated me. I contacted my own lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah who specialized in property rights and civil litigation. After reviewing my evidence, the deeds, surveys, ignored emails, time-stamped photos, security footage, the video of the initial gentle drift, witness statements from the deputies about the clear trespassing evidence, Sarah grinned. "Oh, this is beautiful," she said. They trespassed, ignored warnings, put themselves in a risky situation by remaining on a detached structure during an incoming storm, and now they want to blame you for the weather? Not only are we going to fight this, we're going to countersue. We filed a robust response denying all their claims and filed a cross-complaint against the HOA, and specifically against Brenda, Mark, and Carol as board members who authorized and participated in the trespass. Our suit demanded damages for the trespass itself, compensation for minor damage sustained by my dock during their unauthorized use, and the subsequent chaotic retrieval. Some railings were bent, decking scratched. The cost of reinstalling it correctly at my property line, plus legal fees. We also included a claim for private nuisance. Sarah pointed out that their actions, culminating in the floating fiasco, significantly interfered with my right to enjoy my property, particularly on my birthday weekend. The stage was set for a legal showdown, and unlike the storm-tossed partygoers, I felt well anchored and ready. The legal wrangling dragged on for months, as these things often do. The HOA's lawyers initially tried to play hardball, filing motions, requesting endless depositions, trying to bury us in paperwork. Brenda, Mark, and Carol were deposed, and under Sarah's precise questioning, their stories started to unravel. Brenda tried to maintain her air of haughty justification, claiming an implied easement for community enjoyment of all lakefront features, a concept Sarah dismantled easily using the clear language in the property deeds and HOA bylaws themselves, which specifically delineated private property versus community areas. Brenda's insistence that my dock was basically public crumbled under scrutiny, revealing it as personal opinion rather than legal fact. Mark, visibly sweating, admitted under oath that he'd had misgivings about using my dock after my initial verbal warning but felt pressured by Brenda to go along. He confirmed receiving my emails and acknowledged they were never formally responded to by the board. Carol tried to plead ignorance, claiming she just went where Brenda told her, but admitted seeing the no trespassing signs and feeling it was a bit cheeky to set up anyway. Their claim of reckless endangerment hit a snag when we presented the Weather Service data showing the storm escalated rapidly and unexpectedly after the dock was already adrift due to their continued presence upon it. Sarah argued persuasively that while my action of detaching the dock initiated the drift, it was their decision to remain on an unsecured platform during deteriorating weather conditions, combined with the storm itself, an act of God, that created the primary danger. Furthermore, the dock itself was never compromised. It floated exactly as designed. The real damage was to their pride and their rented party gear. The depositions of the catering staff were also illuminating. They confirmed Brenda directed them onto my property and assured them permission had been granted. They described the initial drift as slow and gentle, only becoming alarming when the storm hit unexpectedly. Their testimony subtly underscored the HOA leadership's responsibility for placing everyone in that situation. Our own evidence was straightforward and damning. The property survey map clearly showed the dock originated from my parcel. The deed language was unambiguous. The timestamp photos and videos documented the trespass, the setup, my warnings being ignored, and the initial calm separation of the dock from the shore well before the storm's peak intensity arrived. We even had the sheriff's deputy's report noting the clear evidence of trespassing and my prior documented warnings. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that releasing the dock at all constituted endangerment, regardless of the storm. Sarah countered brilliantly, comparing it to having trespassers physically removed from your house. An owner has the right to remove intrusions from their property. Here, the intrusion was the entire party setup on the dock. Since physically removing 15 people plus equipment was impractical and potentially confrontational, removing the platform they occupied from my land was, she argued, a unique but conceptually similar remedy to end the ongoing trespass upon my real estate. It was audacious, but legally creative. She stressed I hadn't set it adrift in the middle of a raging storm. I set it adrift in relatively calm conditions, and they stayed on it as the weather turned, refusing or unable to abandon their unauthorized party location. The turning point came during settlement negotiations, mandated by the court before trial. Their lawyer, likely realizing the weakness of their endangerment claim and the strength of our trespass case, started hinting at dropping their suit if we dropped ours. Sarah just smiled. Not a chance, she replied coolly. My client was wronged. Her property rights violated deliberately. The HOA, specifically the board members who orchestrated this, need to be held accountable. We're proceeding with our countersuit. Seeing our refusal to back down, and likely facing pressure from their own insurance carrier, who probably balked at the flimsy endangerment claims versus the solid trespass evidence, the HOA's stance softened considerably. They knew a trial would be embarrassing, costly, and likely result in a judgment against them. Finally, weeks before the court date, they offered a settlement. They would formally drop their lawsuit entirely. On our side, they agreed to pay for the inspection and any necessary repairs to my dock, which were minor, mostly cosmetic scrapes and one bent railing connector. Cover the full cost of having it professionally re-anchored and reattached to my property, pay my legal fees, and issue a formal written apology from the HOA board acknowledging the trespass and guaranteeing it would never happen again. This felt like a significant victory, but Sarah had one more condition. We also want Brenda, Mark, and Carol, the individuals most directly responsible for the decision to trespass, to perform community service. Their lawyer sputtered. That's punitive. It's not usually part of a civil settlement. Consider it restorative justice, Sarah retorted. They showed profound disrespect for private property and community rules. Perhaps contributing positively to the actual community areas will remind them of boundaries. Surprisingly, after some back and forth, they agreed, likely because the three individuals were desperate to avoid the public humiliation and potential personal liability of a trial verdict. The final settlement agreement included a clause requiring Brenda, Mark, and Carol each to complete 40 hours of supervised community service, specifically focused on maintaining and improving the official HOA community spaces, clearing brush at the neglected community beach, painting picnic tables, weeding flower beds. The resolution felt like a profound weight lifted. Watching the salvage crew, paid for by the HOA, carefully maneuver my dock back into position and securely re-anchor it felt like restoring order not just to my property, but to my peace of mind. The bent railing was replaced, the scratches buffed out, good as new, maybe even better, infused with a story of vindication. The formal apology arrived, stiffly worded but clear in its admission of wrongdoing. Seeing Brenda, Mark, and Carol, over the next few weekends, grudgingly weeding the overgrown flower beds and hauling bags of trash away from the community picnic area under the watchful eye of a different, court-appointed volunteer supervisor, someone known for his no-nonsense attitude, was satisfying. Brenda, in particular, seemed physically pained by the manual labor and the visible symbol of her failed power grab. Her usual imperious demeanor was replaced by a sullen pout, her floral muumuus swapped for drab work clothes stained with dirt. Neighbors who had initially been sympathetic to the stranded partygoers' narrative started to understand the full picture once the settlement details and the underlying trespass became common knowledge. Whispers turned from crazy neighbor lady who launched a party to HOA president who thought she owned the lake. Brenda's reign of perceived immunity was effectively over. She remained on the board, her term not yet expired, but her influence was visibly diminished. Meetings became more procedural, less dominated by her whims. Mark and Carol seemed content to fade into the background, rarely speaking up. My relationship with the HOA shifted. There was a grudging respect, perhaps, or maybe just a healthy dose of caution in dealing with me. The imaginary lines Brenda had tried to blur between private ownership and communal desire were now starkly, firmly redrawn. My subsequent birthday barbecue, rescheduled for a few weeks later, was blissfully peaceful. My friends finally heard the full story, raising toasts to property rights and creative problem-solving. Sitting on my dock, watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of orange and purple, I felt a deep sense of contentment. It wasn't just about the dock, or the money, or even the community service, though that added a certain poetic justice. It was about reclaiming my space, my peace, and pushing back against the casual arrogance of those who believe rules and boundaries don't apply to them. Sometimes, setting things adrift is the only way to help them find their proper place. whether it's a floating dock or an overinflated ego. The lake seemed calmer now, the water sparkling just for me, my little slice of paradise defended and restored. And if anyone from the HOA ever eyed my dock again, they knew I had clear boundaries, documented proof, and wasn't afraid to make waves, literally.